I'm 69 years old, and for 38 years I've carried the weight of a promise I couldn't keep to the most innocent soul I ever encountered. Before my heart gives out, the doctors say it's just a matter of months now. I need someone to know about Little Bear, about the 3 weeks in September 1985 when a starving Bigfoot child taught me what unconditional love really means, and about the morning when I had to choose between his life and my own cowardice. My name is Michael Brennan, and back then I was a 31-year-old geologist who'd lost everything that mattered in a span of 6 brutal months. My wife Sarah had died in a car accident that February. My job with the mining company had been eliminated in budget cuts that April, and by September I was hiking alone through the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, trying to walk off a grief so profound that some nights I'd sit by my campfire and seriously consider whether the world would miss me if I just didn't wake up the next morning. I'd been hiking solo for 3 weeks, following old mining trails through country so remote that I sometimes went days without seeing another human being. The solitude was exactly what I needed. No well-meaning friends offering condolences, no family members tiptoeing around my pain, no reminders of the life Sarah and I had built together before a drunk driver stole everything in the space of a heartbeat. It was September 18th when I first heard the crying. Not human crying, but something that carried the same desperate anguish that kept me awake at night. The sound of a soul breaking under weight too heavy to bear. The sound was coming from somewhere up the ridge, beyond a stand of old-growth hemlocks that the loggers had somehow missed during their systematic rape of these mountains in the 1920s. I should have minded my own business. I should have kept walking, focused on my own grief, left whatever was suffering up there to work out its problems without interference from a broken man who couldn't even solve his own. But there was something in that crying that reached through 31 years of civilized conditioning and grabbed hold of the part of me that Sarah had always called my rescue instinct. The same impulse that had made me stop for injured animals, help stranded motorists, and volunteer at the children's hospital where she'd worked as a nurse. What I found in a hollow beneath those ancient hemlocks changed everything I thought I knew about intelligence, family, and what it means to be human. Huddled against the base of a tree that had been growing since before Europeans discovered this continent was a child. There's no other word that does justice to what I saw. Maybe 4 years old in human terms, covered in reddish-brown fur that was matted with mud and pine needles, so thin I could see his ribs through the fur, shivering from cold and hunger, and a kind of despair that no child should ever experience. He was unmistakably one of the creatures that mountain folklore had whispered about for generations, but seeing him up close erased any possibility of thinking in terms of monsters or myths. This was someone's baby, someone's little boy, and he was dying alone in the wilderness because whatever family had protected and cared for him was gone. I called him Little Bear because that's what he looked like, a teddy bear that had been left outside too long, forgotten and abandoned by people who'd moved on to other concerns. His eyes, dark as mountain pools but filled with intelligence that was heartbreakingly human, tracked my approach with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that survival meant evaluating every potential threat and opportunity. But what broke my heart wasn't his obvious suffering or even his impossible existence. It was the way he responded when I knelt down and spoke to him in the same gentle voice Sarah had used with frightened children in the hospital emergency room. He reached out with one tiny hand, perfectly formed but scaled to match his larger frame, and touched my face with a gentleness that spoke of someone who understood kindness and was desperately grateful to encounter it. For 3 weeks, from September 18th until October 9th, 1985, I became Little Bear's protector, caregiver, and the closest thing to family he had in a world that had taken everything else away from him. I taught him to trust humans, to see beyond the fear that his people had carried for generations, to believe that not everyone with my skin color represented death and destruction. He taught me that love doesn't require shared biology, that family can be chosen rather than inherited, and that sometimes the most profound relationships in life come from the most unexpected sources. He also taught me that some responsibilities are too important to abandon, even when keeping them requires more courage than you think you possess. The choice I faced on October 9th still haunts every day of my remaining life. When the hunting party found us, when I had to decide between protecting Little Bear and protecting my own future, I chose myself. I chose my career, my reputation, my comfortable human life over the innocent soul who'd trusted me completely. I let them take him. I let them load Little Bear into a cage designed for dangerous animals, while he looked at me with eyes that couldn't understand why the person he'd come to love as a father was allowing strangers to hurt him. I made a deal that saved my worthless life and condemned the purest heart I've ever known to a fate that still makes me wake up screaming. The heart attack that's killing me is just justice catching up. But before I die, I need someone to know that for 3 weeks in 1985, a dying man and a lost child saved each other in ways that transcended every boundary science claims exists between species. And I need someone to know that when the time came to prove my love was real, I failed him completely. September 18th, 1985, started like every other day of my 3-week journey through the Monongahela. Wake at dawn, break camp mechanically, and start walking deeper into wilderness that matched the emptiness I felt inside. The weather had turned cooler overnight, with morning temperatures in the 40s and a persistent drizzle that made everything feel gray and lifeless. Perfect weather for a man trying to disappear from a world that had stopped making sense. I'd been following an old mining road that curved along Seneca Creek, one of those forgotten routes that had been carved into the mountains by men seeking coal and timber, then abandoned when the easy resources were exhausted. The road was barely visible now, overgrown with 40 years of forest reclamation, but it provided easier walking than bushwhacking through dense undergrowth. That's when I heard it, a sound that stopped me cold about 2 miles upstream from where I'd camped the night before. At first I thought it might be wind through the trees or water flowing over rocks, but as I stood listening, I realized it was something much more disturbing. Someone, or something, was crying with the kind of heartbreak that comes from loss too profound to bear. The sound was coming from up the ridge, maybe a 1/4 mile through forest so thick that visibility was limited to about 50 feet in any direction. My first instinct was to avoid whatever was making that noise. I'd come to these mountains to be alone with my own grief, not to take on someone else's problems. But there was something in the crying that reminded me too much of my own 3 a.m. breakdowns, the nights when Sarah's absence hit me like a physical blow. I left my pack at the base of a distinctive lightning-struck oak and followed the sound uphill, moving carefully through undergrowth that hadn't been disturbed by human passage in decades. The crying grew clearer as I climbed, revealing itself to be unmistakably the sound of a child in distress. Not quite human, but close enough that every parental instinct I'd never had the chance to develop demanded I investigate. The hollow where I found him was hidden beneath a grove of ancient hemlocks, the kind of trees that had been growing since before Europeans arrived in these mountains. The canopy was so dense that very little sunlight reached the ground, creating a cathedral-like space that felt separated from the ordinary world. It was there, curled against the base of the largest hemlock, that I encountered Little Bear for the first time. My initial reaction was complete disbelief. Nothing in my 31 years of life had prepared me for the sight of a creature that belonged in folklore rather than reality, yet was undeniably present and suffering in front of me. He was small, maybe 3.5 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur that showed through the mud and debris he'd been sleeping in. His proportions were human-like but scaled differently, with longer arms and a broader chest that suggested adaptation to forest life. But it was his face that shattered my skepticism and replaced it with immediate concern. Despite features that were clearly non-human, a slightly protruding muzzle, broader nose, more pronounced brow ridge, his expression was unmistakably that of a frightened, exhausted child. His dark eyes held intelligence and awareness that was heartbreakingly familiar. And when he looked up at my approach, I saw the same kind of desperate hope I'd seen in Sarah's pediatric patients who were clinging to life by sheer will. He was starving. Even through the fur, I could see that his ribs were showing, his limbs were too thin, and his movements had the careful economy of someone conserving energy for survival. His lips were cracked from dehydration, and his breathing was shallow in a way that suggested he'd been struggling for food and water for days, maybe weeks. When I knelt down about 10 feet away, speaking in the same gentle tone Sarah had used with frightened children, his reaction was immediate and profound. Instead of fleeing or showing aggression, he tilted his head and made soft sounds that were clearly attempts at communication. When I slowly reached into my jacket for a granola bar, His eyes tracked the movement with desperate attention. I tossed the food gently in his direction, and the way he fell on it, tearing away the wrapper with remarkable dexterity, consuming every crumb with careful attention to avoid waste, told me everything I needed to know about his condition. This wasn't a wild animal grabbing an easy meal. This was someone who understood the value of food and was grateful for any kindness. Over the next hour, as I slowly offered water from my canteen and additional food from my supplies, Little Bear began to trust me enough to allow closer approach. His behavior was consistently intelligent, consistently grateful, and consistently that of a child who'd been taught manners and consideration, but had been separated from whoever had provided that education. The breakthrough came when he reached out with one small hand and gently touched my arm, while making sounds that were unmistakably expressions of gratitude. His touch was warm, careful, and completely trusting, the gesture of someone who recognized kindness and was desperate for any human connection in a world that had become impossibly lonely. That's when I understood that finding Little Bear wasn't a random encounter or an interesting wildlife observation. This was a lost child who needed help, and I was the only person in dozens of square miles who could provide it. The responsible thing would have been to contact park rangers or wildlife authorities, but something in his eyes made me understand that involving official channels would probably mean his death or capture by people who wouldn't see him as someone deserving of protection. So I made a choice that would define the next 3 weeks of my life and haunt the remaining decades. I decided to take care of him myself, to become the family he'd lost, to see if a grieving geologist and a starving Bigfoot child could help each other survive in a world that seemed determined to take away everything that mattered. The first week of caring for Little Bear transformed both our lives in ways I couldn't have imagined when I made the impulsive decision to help him. I moved my camp to a hidden spot about a half-mile from where I'd found him, choosing a location near a reliable water source, but far enough from any trails that we could exist without fear of accidental discovery by other hikers or hunters. Little Bear's physical recovery was remarkably rapid once he had consistent access to food and clean water. I shared everything from my supplies, trail mix, dried fruit, energy bars, instant oatmeal, and supplemented his diet with edibles I found in the forest under his guidance. It turned out he knew more about wilderness survival than I'd learned in 20 years of hiking, able to identify nutritious roots, berries, and plants that could sustain us both when my package supplies ran low. What amazed me most was his intelligence and capacity for learning. Within days, Little Bear had developed a basic understanding of English words for common objects and activities. He learned water, food, sleep, and safe with the quick comprehension of someone whose mind was naturally suited for language acquisition. More remarkably, he began teaching me elements of his own communication system, complex gestures and vocalizations that conveyed detailed information about forest conditions, weather patterns, and the behavior of wildlife in ways that my geological training had never covered. Our daily routine developed organically around his needs and the requirements of remaining hidden. Mornings were spent foraging for food, with Little Bear leading me to resources I would never have found on my own. He showed me which mushrooms were edible, which streams had the cleanest water, and which areas to avoid because they were regularly used by bears or other potentially dangerous wildlife. Afternoons were devoted to what I can only describe as play, though it served important educational purposes for both of us. Little Bear had an insatiable curiosity about human technology and civilization, examining every item in my pack with the focused attention of a scientist studying alien artifacts. My camp stove, flashlight, and compass fascinated him, and he quickly learned to operate them with a dexterity that suggested his species had been observing human technology for generations. But more than his intellectual growth, I treasured watching his emotional recovery. The frightened, starving child I'd found beneath those hemlocks gradually transformed into someone who laughed, played, and showed the kind of joyful curiosity that all healthy children display when they feel safe and loved. He developed a game of hiding my equipment while I was gathering firewood, then revealing himself with delighted giggles when I pretended to search frantically for my missing gear. Little Bear's capacity for affection was profound and healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. He'd sit beside me during evening meals, occasionally reaching over to touch my arm or hand in gestures that were unmistakably expressions of gratitude, and growing attachment. When nightmares about Sarah would wake me up at 3 a.m., I'd often find him sitting quietly nearby, offering comfort through his simple presence without trying to intrude on grief he couldn't fully understand. The communication breakthrough came during our second week together, when Little Bear began combining his natural gestures with the English words he'd learned to tell me about his lost family. Through patient repetition and increasingly sophisticated sign language, he shared a story that explained his presence alone in these mountains and filled in details about his people that no human had ever documented. His family group had consisted of 7 individuals, parents, grandparents, and 2 other children slightly older than himself. They'd been living in a network of caves about 20 miles deeper into the mountains, existing peacefully in territory their people had occupied for generations. Little Bear's drawings in the dirt, combined with his expressive pantomime, painted a picture of a sophisticated culture with complex social relationships, education systems for young ones, and a deep spiritual connection to the forest ecosystems they helped maintain. The tragedy that left him orphaned had occurred about a month before I found him. Hunters, not random poachers but organized professionals with helicopters and tranquilizer equipment, had located his family's caves through systematic searching that suggested government involvement. The attack had happened at night, with gas weapons that incapacitated the adults while the children were separated for individual capture. Little Bear had escaped only because his grandfather had hidden him in a narrow crevice that the hunters hadn't discovered during their systematic search of the cave complex. He'd waited there for 2 days after the sounds of struggle and transportation vehicles had faded, then emerged to find his entire world destroyed. Everything familiar, his parents, siblings, the safe spaces where he'd learned about life, had been stolen by humans who saw his people as specimens rather than families. For 3 weeks, he'd been wandering through forests he didn't know, looking for any trace of his relatives while slowly starving, because his education hadn't yet included the survival skills needed for solitary existence. When I found him, he was maybe 48 hours away from death by exposure and malnutrition. Understanding his story deepened our bond in ways that transcended the barriers between our species. We were both survivors of losses that had fundamentally altered our relationship with the world, both trying to figure out how to continue living when everything that had given life meaning had been taken away. Little Bear had lost his family to human violence. I had lost my wife to human negligence. We found healing in caring for each other. But as our 3rd week together began, I started noticing signs that our hidden sanctuary might not remain secret much longer. Helicopter flights over our area had increased, and I'd found boot prints near water sources that suggested systematic searching by teams with professional tracking experience. Someone was looking for Little Bear, and they were getting closer to finding us both. The paradise we'd created together was living on borrowed time, and I knew that soon I'd face a choice that would define the rest of my life. By early October, living with Little Bear meant living with constant vigilance against discovery by the teams that were systematically searching for him. What had started as occasional helicopter overflights had intensified into daily surveillance patterns that covered every square mile of the Monongahela forest. Ground teams with tracking dogs were working grid searches through areas where his family had been captured, expanding their operational radius as they failed to find traces of the one family member who'd escaped their initial assault. I'd become expert at recognizing the difference between normal Park Service aircraft and the specialized helicopters being used in the search operation. The hunting helicopters flew lower, slower, and in patterns that suggested thermal imaging equipment designed to detect heat signatures through forest canopy. When I heard them approaching, Little Bear and I would hide beneath the densest tree cover we could find, remaining motionless until the aircraft moved beyond our area. The psychological strain of constant concealment was taking its toll on both of us. Little Bear, who had been recovering his natural curiosity and playfulness, began showing signs of the same trauma that had nearly killed him when I first found him. The sound of helicopters would send him into silent panic, cowering against my body with trembling that could last for hours after the aircraft had passed. He understood that the people searching for him represented the same threat that had destroyed his family. My own mental state was deteriorating under the weight of decisions I'd never anticipated having to make. Every day of caring for Little Bear deepened our emotional bond, but it also increased my legal and personal exposure to consequences that could destroy my remaining life. Harboring what government agencies probably classified as an unidentified biological entity was certainly illegal under laws I didn't fully understand, and the search operation's intensity suggested that federal authorities were treating his capture as a matter of national security. Worse than the legal implications was the growing certainty that our situation was unsustainable. Little Bear needed medical attention that I couldn't provide. His recovery from near starvation had been remarkable, but he still showed signs of nutritional deficiencies that required specialized care. He needed contact with his own kind, education about his people's culture and survival techniques, and the kind of stability that a life spent hiding in wilderness caves could never provide. Most heartbreakingly, he needed a future that didn't involve constant fear of capture by people who would treat him as a laboratory specimen rather than a conscious being deserving of protection and respect. The hunting teams weren't searching for Little Bear because they wanted to reunite him with surviving relatives or provide him with appropriate care. They wanted to complete the specimen collection that had been interrupted when his grandfather's desperate sacrifice allowed one family member to escape. The crisis came on October 8th, when I discovered that our hidden camp had been compromised. I'd gone to refill our water containers at the creek, leaving Little Bear sleeping in his improvised shelter, when I found boot prints in soft mud that were less than 6 hours old. Someone had been within 50 yards of our location during the night, close enough to have detected our presence if they'd been using the right equipment, or if Little Bear had made any noise during his sleep. The tracks told a story that chilled me to my core. Professional searchers, probably a 3-person team based on the distinct boot patterns, had been conducting a systematic search of stream beds and water sources, following protocols designed to locate anyone living rough and wilderness conditions. They'd missed finding us by pure chance, but their search pattern indicated they'd be back to cover areas they'd only examined superficially. That night, as Little Bear slept curled against my side in the way that had become his normal source of comfort and security, I lay awake facing the most difficult decision of my life. I could continue trying to protect him, knowing that discovery was now inevitable and would probably result in both our captures. Or I could make contact with the search teams myself, hoping to negotiate some kind of arrangement that might protect his welfare while acknowledging the legal realities of our situation. The responsible choice was obvious. Little Bear deserved protection by people with resources and authority far beyond what a grieving geologist could provide. Medical care, legal advocacy, maybe even contact with other members of his species who might have survived previous capture operations. All of these were possibilities that I couldn't offer, but that government agencies might be able to arrange. But I also knew enough about bureaucratic thinking to understand that Little Bear's welfare would be secondary to research opportunities and potential military applications that his capture might provide. The same mentality that had destroyed his family would determine his treatment in government custody, and the chances that he'd be treated as a person rather than a specimen were essentially zero. The hunting party found us at dawn on October 9th, approaching our camp with military precision while we were still sleeping. I woke to the sound of boots moving through undergrowth and voices coordinating positions around our perimeter. By the time I was fully conscious, Little Bear and I were surrounded by 6 armed men with tranquilizer weapons and containment equipment designed for dangerous wildlife. The team leader, a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority, approached our position with his weapon trained on Little Bear while speaking in the calm, professional tone of someone conducting a routine operation. "Sir, I'm Agent Morrison with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You're harboring a protected species that requires immediate medical attention and proper care facilities. We need you to step away from the animal so we can safely transport it to appropriate research facilities." That's when I faced the choice that would haunt the remaining decades of my life. I could fight to protect Little Bear, knowing that resistance would probably result in both our deaths or imprisonment. Or I could cooperate with people who had the authority to destroy both our lives legally, hoping that submission might somehow lead to mercy neither of us deserved to expect. The moment I'll carry to my grave happened when Agent Morrison offered me a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Standing in our hidden camp with 6 armed agents surrounding the makeshift family Little Bear and I had created, He laid out terms that revealed exactly how little our 3 weeks together had meant to the people who held all the power. "Mr. Brennan, we've been tracking your movements through financial records and gear purchases for the past week," Morrison explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing weather patterns. "We know you found this specimen approximately 3 weeks ago, and we understand that civilian contact was probably inevitable given its condition when you encountered it. What matters now is your cooperation and its safe transfer to appropriate research facilities." Little Bear pressed against my side, trembling with the same terror he'd shown during helicopter overflights, but magnified by the immediate presence of armed humans who represented everything his people feared. His small hands gripped my jacket with desperate strength, and he made soft sounds that were unmistakably pleas for protection from someone he'd learned to trust completely. Morrison continued outlining my options while his team maintained weapons trained on a 4-year-old child, whose only crime was existing in a world that saw his kind as property to be collected, rather than people deserving of protection. I could face federal charges for harboring an endangered species without permits, interference with government research operations, and violation of national security protocols that carried mandatory minimum sentences. Or I could accept witness protection, relocation assistance, and a federal pension in exchange for my cooperation and permanent silence about what I'd experienced. "The specimen requires immediate medical attention that only specialized facilities can provide," Morrison added, gesturing toward Little Bear with the clinical detachment of someone discussing laboratory equipment. "Your continued interference with its capture is actually endangering its welfare. The responsible thing is to let professionals handle its care and study." But I could see the truth in Little Bear's eyes as he looked up at me with the same trust and love he'd shown every day for 3 weeks. He didn't understand the words being spoken, but he understood the situation perfectly. These were the same people who had destroyed his family, and now they wanted to complete their specimen collection by taking the last survivor. The choice they offered me wasn't between his welfare and my freedom. It was between his continued existence as a free being and his imprisonment in facilities designed to unlock whatever biological secrets his people represented to military and scientific interests. Morrison wasn't offering to protect Little Bear. He was offering to make his enslavement legal and systematic. That's when I made the most cowardly decision of my life. Looking into the eyes of someone who loved me unconditionally, someone who had trusted me to protect him from exactly this situation, I chose my own safety over his freedom. I stepped away from Little Bear and raised my hands in surrender, abandoning the only family I'd had since Sarah's death to people who would cage him like a dangerous animal. The betrayal in his eyes as I moved away from him will haunt whatever time I have left on this earth. Little Bear reached toward me with both hands, making sounds that were unmistakably calls for help, for explanation, for some indication that the person he'd come to see as a father figure hadn't just sold him to his worst enemies. When I couldn't meet his gaze, when I stood silent while Morrison's team approached him with restraints designed for wild animals, his cries became heartbroken wails that sounded exactly like the grief I'd found him expressing when we first met. They tranquilized him when he tried to run to me, shooting him with enough chemicals to drop an adult bear. Little Bear collapsed mid-stride, his last conscious act an attempt to reach someone who'd already abandoned him. As the drugs took effect, he looked at me with eyes that couldn't understand why love had turned into betrayal, why the person who'd taught him to trust humans was allowing strangers to hurt him. Morrison honored his agreement exactly as promised. I was relocated to Oregon under a new identity, with a federal pension that ensured I'd never want for money and legal protection that guaranteed my story would never become public knowledge. All I had to do was sign documents acknowledging my cooperation with a classified research operation and agree to never discuss what I'd witnessed during my time in the Monongahela forest. I've spent 38 years trying to convince myself that Little Bear is being treated humanely in whatever facilities house him, that my cooperation led to medical care and protection, rather than the systematic exploitation I feared. But I know the truth. Somewhere in underground laboratories that don't officially exist, the gentle soul who taught me what unconditional love means has spent 4 decades as a research subject for people who see him as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a person deserving of freedom. The heart attack that's killing me started the day I realized that Little Bear would be middle-aged now, assuming he's even still alive. He'd be someone's father if he'd been allowed to live freely, teaching his own children about survival and kindness and the complicated nature of the humans who both threatened and protected his people. Instead, he spent his life in captivity, because the one person who could have protected him chose comfort over courage. I never had children with Sarah, never got the chance to be the father I'd dreamed of becoming. Little Bear gave me 3 weeks to understand what it felt like to love someone more than your own life, to feel responsible for another being's welfare in ways that transcended every other consideration. When the test came, when I had the opportunity to prove that love was real, I failed completely. That's my confession. That's what's killing me faster than any heart disease ever could. Somewhere in a government facility, a being who once trusted me completely probably still wonders why the person he loved as family betrayed him when he needed protection most. I pray that he's forgotten me entirely, because the alternative, that he remembers our 3 weeks together and still hopes for rescue that will never come, is more than my dying conscience can bear.